Hi, everybody. It's the afternoon, but you're still with us, right? Okay, everyone's had their coffee. So we have three amazing panelists here, and we are going to plan to have some question time at the end. So think of your questions. It's more exciting if when we get to the question period, people ask questions as opposed to just sitting quietly. So I'm going to introduce my panelists here. This is Brad Feld, which I think a lot of people probably already know. He is the co-founder of the Foundry Group and Techstars and has invested in Formlabs, MakerBot, and Glowforge, all in this space. And then we have Eric Paley, who actually launched a company in this space, Brontes, which does 3D scanning and 3D printing of dental devices. So, and then he sold that to 3M in 2006, and is now with the Founder Collective, a seed stage venture capital firm which invested in Formlabs, MakerBot, Tulip, Desktop Metal, a lot of startups in this space. And then we have Karen Carr, who is the executive director of advanced and additive manufacturing at GE Ventures. So we have a corporate VC on our panel. And before that, she was both the managing director of Arch Venture Partners and also worked at the University of Southern California, helping faculty and students turn their innovation into companies. So I think particularly relevant given that we're here at MIT. So I have a question for each of them, and then we're going to do some general questions. I'm going to start with Brad. So you invested in MakerBot in 2011, and at that time you wrote that, I believe that we'll look back in 20 years and 3D printers will be as ubiquitous as laser printers are today. Do you still believe that?
I do. It's only 6 years later, so we got 14 more years to go. How many of you remember the Jetsons?
Oh, wow.
Okay, good, almost everybody. So, and how many of those people remember the Matterport? A couple? Remember the thing that looked like a vending machine and it had like things you pressed on it, and you could press like different types of food or like different things, like an iron. They were really prosaic things that came out of the Matterport, and you'd press a button and like out of the wall would come the thing. And that was 1963, and I still want that. You know, I think one of the challenges, broad challenges of 3D printing and 3D printing industry in general has been the shift from a view of it as an industrial product, industrial process, to something that is more accessible to a much broader audience. And the way you have to think about that is all of a sudden envisioning 100 times or 1,000 times the number of units that have been sold historically. And if you sort of have paid attention to Formlabs and Formlabs acceleration and the number of SLA machines that they've sold, that dynamic of this increasing acceleration of lower cost product is happening at a very, very fast rate. And in that context, it's not that you have to drive the price down to $200. If you remember, there's still an awful lot of, well, there's plenty of, you know, $250 or $300 laser printers sold today. That's what, almost 40-something years later. There's still an awful lot of $1,000 to $2,500 laser printers sold today. And that arc, I don't know the number of laser printers sold, but it's hundreds of millions, maybe more. That dynamic, I think, will play out with 3D printers. Okay.
And so, do you think we're going to get to the point where everyone is going to, you know, where grandma's going to have a 3D printer on her desk?
I don't know that that's a necessary goal in the context of broad ubiquity of these products. I think about my parents, where my mother, I could now say, is grandma. And they have a laser printer in their house. And the idea that they'd have something in their house that did 3D stuff in addition to 2D stuff is certainly believable. What they will use that 3D product for, in terms of not just the physical creation and instantiation of product, but also the sort of ingest and creativity is very powerful. And so the idea that you can do it on lots of different vectors is key. But I think you can also sort of wander into a professional environment and think about a typical office where right now there might be industrial 3D printers that are in a physical space, and you've got a bunch of engineers and a bunch of designers that if they want to use the 3D printers, they go to the physical space to use the 3D printers versus having them in their work group or on their desktop. So I think that is a transition point is much more likely than all of a sudden everybody's buying them at Best Buy and putting them in their spare bedroom.
Right. Okay. Okay, good. Eric, so you started a 3D printing company yourself and have invested in MakerBot, Formlabs, Desktop, Metal. Do you have sort of an overarching thesis with all of these 3D printing companies you're investing in?
Yeah, I want the, what did you call it?
You want the Matterport.
Matterport. It was the Star Trek generator for me, but
yeah,
I want to say tea, Earl Grey hot, and it just appeared. But so let me see if I can answer that and also build on what Brad said to some degree. We really don't have an overall thesis. We're very interested in technology shifts and what those things enable, but we start much more with what those things enable. So I agree with Brad that, I don't know, I'm never good at calling the timelines on these things. I think things take way longer than you think until the moment when they happen way faster in that moment than you'd ever imagine. But I do think Grandma will have a 3D printer, I really do. But I think the thing we look for as a company and why we make the investments we do, why I started Brontes, and why we invest in these companies is super compelling founders who have a vision for what to enable with these technologies. What are these technologies going to do for people? So 3D printing's been around a really, really long time, right? So long now that many of the original patents are actually expired on these things, which has enabled a new generation of companies. That's a long horizon, right? I mean, when you spin something out of MIT at first, we did at Brontes, you don't even worry about when the patents are going to expire. That's so far in the future. And yet, that's how, this stuff's been around a long time. But I think the innovation that we're seeing is accelerated by the idea of what can we do with this? This sort of like focus on, okay, then now what, right? And I think the idea that you're going to do SLA at your desk, that's just not what 3D Systems really seriously was trying to do with SLA, right? And so I think the reason Grandma will have it, we don't know exactly what that is yet, is going to be around what does it enable for Grandma? Does it enable the 3D printing of her pharmaceuticals? Does it enable, which means that they're exactly dosed for her and delivered to her in the right way and tweakable by the doctor iteratively in the moment? That might be why Grandma has a 3D printer. But it might be something completely different, like she really likes hot Earl Grey tea, and the printer's making that for her. And we can chuckle right now about that, but I think it's important to think of it from the standpoint of it's hard to imagine right now where this technology will go, what it will enable, but it will enable things that will keep pushing further and further to the frontier of what it's used for. And that's why it will be, that's why, MakerBots are in many, many people's homes today, was because MakerBot had a vision for what this type of technology could enable if you brought the cost low enough.
I think Grandma's going to want it in her house for dentures.
Well, which would,
Come on, I mean, that's like a setup, Mr. Brontes,
it is,
right?
It is. Anything dental is very inspiring to me. Yeah.
And Grandma's going to lose her dentures, so she can just print a new set.
Yeah, 3D print your teeth anytime you need them.
This idea of the 3D printing the medications, I haven't heard about that here today. I've been trying to listen pretty closely to all the presentations, but that's pretty interesting.
I think wine 15 years in the future, right? I mean, this Eric's point is a really important one. It's one of the challenges, I think, around innovation that exists is the difference between sort of looking at this and looking way out there. And like I think Carl Bass talked about it this morning in his discussion about 50 years of AI that really made, I mean, there was a lot of foundational progress in 50 years of AI, and then there was this incredible change in 3 years that were enabled by a handful of different things. And across lots of different vectors, we see the same phenomenon. In 2006, if you talked about what this is today, sure, people would have looked at you, and Steve Ballmer, I don't know, might have said something like, that's stupid. Nobody would ever pay $500 for a phone. and
did.
you know, a billion phones later, right? So it just happens in these very brief moments, but it's not that it happened in the brief moment, it's that there was a big buildup to that brief moment where the dislocation occurred.
And the distinction I'm making on top of that is we get very excited about technology. We all do, right? But I think the key question is not just the technological innovation, it's the human side of it. Who, for what, for whom, in what way? What does this do for people? How does it make them better, happier, more efficient, more productive, whatever that is? And it's the answer to those questions that actually is what pushes these technologies into the world. And if you don't focus on those questions, you just focus on the tech, you have this crazy hype cycle that doesn't actually end up playing out.
I don't know if grandma's going to have a 3D printer, but I'm pretty sure that most manufacturers and industrialists will. So GE, I think we're at a moment when additive could really take off now, because you were right, it's been there for 30-something years. Probably one of the first deals I looked at as a young venture capitalist at Arch was in additive manufacturing. And you know, quality's been poor and the like, but we've gotten to a stage now where companies like GE can actually print parts that fly on airplanes. What it's allowed us to do, the technology has really actually allowed us to change the way we manufacture and really change the way that we design products. And so what we're looking for, and we're investors in Desktop Metal and we're investors in Carbon, and GE itself bought an interest in 2 powder bed laser sintering companies and 1 electron beam company. Because we really see this, we're at this tipping point where we're really going to start to have products made. We're investing in things that are going to radically step function changes in the speed to help lower the production costs. And then if we layer on top of that innovations in design, where I can take 20 parts and make them 1, then I really start to ride that cost curve.
So you actually sort of answered the question I was going to ask for you. So I'm going to throw this next one to you. You can start with, and then if you guys want to jump in, please do. In particular, with your experience at USC, and because we're at MIT, a research university, when do you know that an idea that's sort of been developed in a research lab or in an innovation center is ready to become a company? When is it ready for investment dollars and has the potential to become a growing and profitable company?
So a lot of that is actually about the who and the people and the passion. And some of it is about the technology, but it is really trying to find what the market fit is and how they can enter in at a price point that's suitable for where the technology is. So I think you have to think about it a little bit generationally, but mostly it's about the people.
And what about you guys? When do you think an innovation or a new technology is ready for investment and has the potential to actually become a company?
So we have this thing that when we're looking at a technology, sort of an innovative new university-based technology, most entrepreneurs pitch us a list of applications. And we think as long as you have a list, you haven't figured out what you're doing, right? Because it's really hard to do anything. And to focus on one thing is, it's a massive concession for the technology. Right, I think for somebody who invented a technology, for Doug Hart, who invented the seed of what became Brontes, who's a professor here, the idea that we were going to use it to go after dentistry was probably pretty disappointing, right? There are so many things we could do. And by the way, I think it would have been disappointing no matter what industry we had gone after, because look at all that optionality you give away. And I think at some point you've got to get focused enough where you can have a real customer development process and ultimately a real discussion with customers about building something that actually really matters to them, that isn't just technology. And it's really hard to do that while you still have a list. So I think the biggest thing is sort of getting from a technology that can do many things, a list of applications, here's what we want to go do, and then the customer development work to validate that it makes sense what you want to go do. Like, here's what we're learning that makes us believe this could be a really exciting company. And that's usually if there's really some magic there and the chemistry feels really good, exceptional people, that's that makes for, I think, that's what births these things into the world.
I'd add to that.
That's Brad's way of saying he disagrees.
I agree, and I would add to it. So layer on top versus disagreeing. If I disagreed, I'd just say you're wrong.
I've heard it before.
We started Foundry Group a little bit over a decade ago, so 2007. We funded companies. We've done about 90 investments. I'm going to guess about a dozen of them have roots at MIT. Most of those roots, not all, but most are Media Lab. And I think the combination of these two constructs, one is the people, and I would say the motive force to create a product versus iterate on research is the linkage. And so that combination, like you can have people, even if they're incredibly smart, MIT, Stanford, University of Colorado, doesn't matter, in a research environment, that don't have the motive force to go focus on product. And that's the key linkage. Interestingly, most of the companies that when I think about when we've invested before everybody's talking about the thing. And I think our general view is that once everybody's talking about the thing, it's probably too late to invest. And so you're trying to get this balance between finding the people that have the research and the motive to build product before all of a sudden everybody's talking about this area. And that's interesting when you find it as an investor, especially if Eric's invested before you have, because Eric and his firm invest at the very beginning. We don't have to invest at the very beginning, but we're usually the next investor. Like looking for those things that all of a sudden you can say, that's the product. And then when you wind the clock forward 5 or 6 or 7 years, and this is why 20 years, and I like to say it's 20 years, but I like to think 20 years from today. So if you're 6 years into an experience, you're really looking at 26 years out. From the beginning, 20 years forward. Like that forward view is so key because in year 6, whatever you're doing is going to be totally different in terms of some of the characteristics of that thing that you started with because of the way the technology evolves. One of the things that's totally fascinating to me around Formlabs versus my investment in MakerBot and just that 6 years of timing is the notion of the ability to do something with horizontal scaling. There were lots of conversations early on, 2011, 2012, 2013, about connecting all of these 3D printers via the internet and the cloud and being able to sort of print anywhere and do all this. I mean, that was sort of a theoretical conversation against the backdrop of just trying to get the plastic to move through the extruder in a way that made a thing that held together and didn't look stupid, right? Today, we're talking about racks of 5 machines with the whole build process, including washing and curing, that you can just stack up and scale horizontally. The same way, if you think about, the easy metaphor is mainframe computing, right? Keep building a bigger and bigger single monolithic computer. That was a model, and the model that today is being used by pick your company that's building super scaled out infrastructure, whether it's proprietary like Facebook or not so proprietary like AWS or even Google Cloud. These are massively distributed, horizontally scaled infrastructure off of relatively small and inexpensive base componentry. And that's a totally different way of thinking about it. I think we're in our world now with 3D printing where that's becoming enabled. And it's enabled not just because of the hardware print capability, but the internet, movement of data, integration of not just data formats, but actually the notion of automation of all that stuff. 6 years ago, you could talk about that. 6 years later, you're starting to have that. I don't know what it's going to look like 6 years from now, but back to Karen's point, like that step function happens really fast when it happens, and this could be one of them. So you weren't wrong. You're right.
So
I think you agreed. Anyway.
Do you guys feel that, as VCs who are investing in hardware, that that is sort of a minority? I think a lot of VCs are looking to get a return on their investment very quickly and are interested in software. Do you think that you are in the minority as investing in hardware? And what do you think entrepreneurs in the hardware space could do to improve their chance at getting venture capital dollars?
Well, I think hardware investing is hard. That's for sure. And certainly I think there are fewer groups doing it, but there are certainly more groups doing it. And interestingly enough, more groups interested these days in what I'll call more enterprise tech, and maybe shifting a little bit away from some of the consumer tech, although these guys may dispute it, but we're in some deals together, so maybe they'll agree. I think the software, though, is enabling for a lot of that hardware, and is ultimately where a lot of the value gets captured. So if we think about what Carbon is doing on the polymer print side, Desktop Metal is doing the same thing on the metal side. Software is a big component of how they monetize the product and how they enable 3D printing. But I think the same could be said of another company that's an MIT spin-out that we're invested in, Rethink Robotics. They've got a very interesting collaborative robot, but the software on how you program it and their ability to essentially be the control system in a cell is quite interesting. So I would encourage hardware entrepreneurs to think a lot about the software.
When we made, again, we started in 2007, we made a handful of what were either hardware or consumer electronics investments in the first couple of years of our fund. And we don't think of ourselves as hardware investors. The area that we group investments like Formlabs in is something we call human-computer interaction. It's a theme around the premise that the way that humans and computers interact will be radically different 20 years from now, in the same way it's radically different 20 years in the past. An early investment in HCI for us was a company called Fitbit, which we invested in before the phrase wearables existed. And our idea was this notion of instrumenting yourself as a human would be something that in this context of HCI we do. The way we thought about that investment was that it was software wrapped in plastic. So we weren't focused on the hardware. We were focused on the software component of it, knowing that much of the hardware, not all of it, but much of the hardware over time would commoditize. Now, the way you assembled those commodity pieces of hardware mattered, because anybody who's ever tried to build a piece of hardware knows that you can take the same components and build a really shitty piece of hardware, and same components and build a really amazing piece of hardware. But the software embedded within that product, as well as the software that communicates with that product, whether it's on a mobile device or on a computer or in the cloud or anything else, or sensor to sensor, all of that software layer is critically important. And it goes to where we like to think, again, wind the clock forward many years, we're seeing it in science fiction films now, is are we going to be talking about human-enhanced computers or computer-enhanced humans? And which of those two things are we going to be dealing with, and does it really matter? Right? And we're not talking about artificial intelligence, right? It's the linkage between the way that as humans... Is
it an either or? Maybe they're both.
I would argue they're the same, right? And people say, well, I don't understand how we're going to be humans that are computer enhanced. Well, if anybody has a pacemaker, you're already computer enhanced.
If you're wearing a microphone right now.
You're computer enhanced. It's a very good looking microphone on you.
Thanks.
Turn your head that way so they can see. Right? So this notion of that interface is really key. And the magic from an investor perspective in terms of long-term sustainability is not just the physical hardware invention. And I think that's where a big shift of investing in this cycle has been. And people like Eric and Karen that have made investments in companies that prototypically would be called hardware companies understand the critical importance of software, not just in the product, but in the whole user experience around the product.
I think there's some other really interesting elements to it. And I think when Brad says software, he means software traditionally also means internet.
Yep.
And maybe also what community can mean. I mean, I think one of the
software.
One of the lost things on the story of MakerBot is how much that community powered that business and how unique it was to actually build a community around a hardware product. Getting back just a little bit.
I just want to pause. It's a great distinction because I should be careful, especially in an audience with a bunch of people think about hardware, about defining software. For me, Thingiverse, which is what Eric's talking about, is software, right? So that linkage is not a distinction of, oh, and then there's this other thing. It's all woven together. And the absence of that weaving together is what causes the products themselves to be relatively uninteresting. When you can get all those pieces woven together, become very powerful.
Yeah, and I think it also gets back to this whole thing about what does it do for humans? And again, humans can also be in the enterprise, in the factory, yep. But what does it do and what does it enable for humans? And, it's an object, it's physical, it's software, it's digital, it's internet, but all of those things are unto themselves, they're all commodities if you don't get back to what do they do for humans. Because when something works well, we stick with it. And if companies keep innovating, they get better and better and better, and we stay with it. And so, but yes, hardware is hard. I actually like Ben Einstein at Bolt. He's come to stop saying it. He's now says, don't say hardware's hard. Everything's hard. And I think it's actually, when I read that, I was like, he's kind of right. It's not as if we've had more or less success in our hardware portfolio. MakerBot was really terrific for us, and Cruise Automation was really terrific for us, and yet we've had lots of success in software companies too. And by the way, I've had lots of failure in hardware and in software, and building companies is hard. I think one of the really nice things about hardware is, even though the ramp up might be a little bit slower, although it's getting faster and faster, we were talking about this backstage a little bit, there is this opportunity, and people assume commoditization, there is actually this opportunity with hardware in some ways to build something a little more sustaining. Because it does take time for other people to ramp up, and it takes time for other people to copy you. And when people physically touch something, they also feel much more connected to it. So there's some really nice elements in hardware that are the reason why people who had Fitbits 5 years ago still have Fitbits, right?
Actually, one of the interesting things, though, on the hardware piece and the software linkage is, the software can enable functionality in hardware over time, even without changing the hardware itself. So normally you would think about sort of the cost of getting it wrong, but you can improve over time with some software upgrades to some limited.
Just think about what Tesla's done relative to every other car that's ever been created, right? You don't get a new rev of your car ever. Right, they might do some firmware upgrade for some stupid problem they're having that they want to fix. Or a new map, right? You get a new map, which nobody uses because we all use Waze anyway. Yeah. But that car, that Tesla reinvents itself every few months. Literally, the UX changes. You have self-driving capability enabled. You have all of these changes that happen with the car that, for over 100 years of car manufacturing, there's never been a car that adapts. And this one does. And I think that's a lot of why I think we all like hardware. But yes, it is a little tougher to fund. I think the truth is hardware has actually become more of a theme for investors in recent years than it was certainly when I started a hardware company in 2003. So I think it actually has gotten a little bit easier.
Do you worry about, if you invest in a hardware company, that the hardware could be copied? I mean, is that part of your process when you're thinking about it?
Everything can be copied. I've ceased to worry about that.
So how far are you ahead?
Yeah, I think sort of one of the challenges is understanding what is unique to your business and making sure that what you're uniquely great at, you're doing in a way and a pace separate from what everybody else is. And the piece that you're not uniquely great at, or that is a commodity, is not something that you're expecting to be a durable advantage. And I think it's a mistake a lot of software companies make, and it's one of the problems if you look at it, take the B2B SaaS world today for software. I don't know the number of what I would consider to be scaled B2B SaaS companies, but it's probably 5,000 to 10,000 at this point that are 10 million or more of revenue a year. Like they look like real businesses now. And there's probably 100 categories, maybe 200 categories. So you've got a whole bunch of people sort of doing the same kinds of things for 80% of what they do, and the 20% that's different in the product is not enough to differentiate the products. The thing that differentiates those companies for the most part is their sales machine, their marketing positioning, their partnering activity, customer care dynamics, like all these things that have nothing to do with the product. And so that is true also in the hardware world. There was a CES, I don't remember the year, 2012, maybe, or 2013, I think there was something like 100 companies at CES that had some kind of wearable. Must have been 2012, like literally 100 of them. And you look and you're like, what the fuck? Like, this is totally nonsensical. CES last year, anybody into home robots? Anybody here? Anybody have a home robot yet?
Does a Roomba count?
Yeah.
No, Roomba's not a home robot. Okay. Roomba's a home skate. It's a pet.
It's a pet.
Roomba's a pet. Colin and his friends at iRobot created a pet. All right, so very few home robots. There were over.
If you include Amazon Echo, I bet a lot of hands go up in this room.
That's fair. At CES, there were over 100 anthropomorphic robots. They looked like little people of some sort. Some of them looked like R2-D2 a little bit. All of them sucked, right? And all of them had proprietary software, and all of them were hard to do anything with. But you could see, right? You can see this wave coming of where people are going to want to have the ability to do that. And then you look at the adjacent. So you set me up for the adjacent, which is Amazon Echo. How many of you talked to your computer 3 years ago? And how many of you talk to your computer on a regular basis today? Right? Alexa, play death metal. Right? And then my wife says, Alexa, play Windham Hill. And it's this continual, you're just talking to Alexa. Right? We're in that, again, step function shift. Like all of a sudden, after 30, 40 years of voice recognition and voice being the future of this stuff, boom. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that in the next decade as many of these technologies and the interconnectedness of it and the software layer behind the scenes enables all of this hardware to do the magical things that the Jetsons have been talking about since the 1960s.
I mean, so the way we think about commoditization, hardware or software makes no difference, is there a way to get better and better and better? Or does it just end with the product? So it's like, I'm sure Vitamix is a great business, but we'd be much less excited to invest in it, right? Because we're like, you ship a blender, and people love it, and then you're kind of done. And people can rip that off and replicate it. Again, I'm sure it's a great business. Too bad we're not investors. But I think that's really hard. I think that's where this hardware-software link is so powerful, because if you can see how this digital pedometer, which is an extension of the human being, because now they're wearing it all the time and they understand what steps they're getting. But you start to think about, how do we get smarter and smarter at this? How do we get better and better? And there is this trajectory of long, meaningful periods of time of getting better and better and better. To us, that's exciting, because the smartest people are the best positioned to get better and better and better. They don't always win, by the way. I mean, it doesn't always work that way, but that's the opportunity.
Is this the part I get to make fun of Juicero?
Feel free.
I mean, you said Vitamix.
No, it's all good.
So actually, I was...
You get better at squishing the bag down? Is that the...
I've been practicing.
Yeah.
I was supposed to start asking questions about a minute ago. I want to open it up in case anyone has any. Oh, all right, good.
So today we saw some...
Oh, there's a mic coming. Oh, good. Okay.
Some order of magnitude improvements in the hardware around additive manufacturing. But a lot of the interesting companies that have been brought up today, software has obviously been a very key element to the business model. And no doubt these products have a lot of software. But one missing thing seems to be democratizing the creation of the products that can be printed. It's still a lot of geekery and hard to use a lot of the software tools to design products. Do you ever see that being democratized, or are you aware of anything that's making that easier?
I mean, you should totally do it, right? I mean, that's the entrepreneurial's moment right there. Is there's this huge opportunity, doesn't feel like anyone's doing it, and the answer is yes. I've seen numerous companies focused on, perhaps some of the use cases weren't as strong as I thought they should be, but definitely focused on how do you democratize this stuff, how do you make it easier to change? You know, it's like in ceramics, how do we make it so you can just stretch it and pull it and make it bigger, and the bowl comes higher and you engrave it? And those use cases don't get me excited, because I don't think the mass consumer really wants to specifically do that. But there will be more and more things that the mass consumer does want to do. And not all it is, because it's really hard, but it's the entrepreneurial passion of seeing an opportunity like that and saying, this is what I want to do. And by the way, some of it is just making CAD easier and easier, which there are some great companies, including here in Boston, working on that. But some of it is more for different specific use cases?
I think about that in terms of the democratization for the supply chain, not necessarily, your mom and pop, but your mom and pop, CNC shop being able to use these kinds of tools. And that, I think, does require radical redesign. And I think if you look at Desktop Metals, you look at Carbon, you look at Autodesk, Onshape, a lot of those groups are working on tools that will allow some of that democratization.
I'd add that it happens on lots of different vectors, but not in coordination. And an example from our portfolio would be a company called MakeTime that's in Lexington, Kentucky. And the founder his family was a machine shop owner. And he woke up one day and he said, there's a whole bunch of these small machine shops all over the Midwest and all over the East Coast, and they're all underutilized. And what if we could create a layer that connects them all together? Again, an industrial versus consumer, but allows anybody that needs, any manufacturer who needs a customized part to use slack capacity that exists, and on the other side of it, create a marketplace. I mean, is that, democratization of innovation? It's a layer of it. Is that like a dominant thing that everybody embraces overnight? No way, right? So the thing that's happening is there's lots of experiments like that, and if you wind the clock forward, hopefully enough of them take hold. And I think it's going against both historical industrial products and then the next generation of companies that are making these products. I think Formlabs is right in the middle of that in terms of the type of products they're creating. We also have an investment in a subtractive manufacturing company called Glowforge. Same premise, like that software layer to allow anybody to interact with anybody else. In a lot of ways comes back to the roots of that idea that the MakerBot gang came up with Thingiverse, which is, if you do all the hard work to make a fancy STL file that does something, just upload it here and anybody else can download it and print it on their MakerBot. Like that was a huge advance versus what's an STL file.
It's truly democratization, and it was a great example of software augmenting hardware because they built that community, right? I think there's a lot of, I think GrabCAD was an interesting one on the enterprise or more industrial side, design side. Yeah. There's a lot, and there's going to be, there will be people in this room who will potentially, likely create interesting companies that make it more democratized and all of this technology more valuable to everybody.
I think the other part that causes that to accelerate is more and more people having access to machines, whatever those machines are, that are interconnected with whatever the data and programmatic sources are. So you get out of this world where you have a machine in a machine shop or a machine in a big facility that has proprietary software, and that machine is its own little thing. And all of a sudden, that machine is connected to the internet, and you're able to access from your browser all kinds of different things that interact with that machine and all the other machines on, in the manufacturing facility. And all of a sudden, that allows at an industrial layer for that to happen. That's happening in parallel, I think, at a prosumer level already. And some of those companies will work, some won't. But my guess is if we look back a decade from now, that ability to interact that way will have evolved. In the same way today, desktop publishing is kind of a weaker metaphor because we don't think about it anymore because it's 30 years old. But if you're old enough, I'm old enough, like 10 years after desktop publishing was started, and you no longer had to start from scratch, and there was a whole bunch of stuff, you want to do a newsletter, you want to do a this, you want to do a that, boom, you could do it.
And by the way, it's a really virtuous cycle, right? Because if people didn't imagine home computers, home desktop publishing applications wouldn't happen. But once those applications come out and get better and better and better, more and more people are buying computers. And so they get more and more exposed to it, and now they're creating Facebook, right? I mean, it's this progression of, they said one of the reasons Bill Gates became Bill Gates is he had access, somebody knows this story better than me, but to a mainframe computer as a young child that virtually nobody had access to. But today, every kid can have that level of access, and so there's this massive democratization. So I think you'll see that virtuous cycle happening in this space too.
We got to keep the IP and GR, more of that thing that we're sharing.
Yeah, I mean, digital rights management is going to be an issue here. We're certainly seeing some companies work on that. If you think about the IP as just, bits and bytes, how do you protect that?
Well, the good news is our government's hard at work clarifying all those rules.
I think we have time for one more question, if it's relatively quick.
Sorry, we don't have time for one more question.
Okay. Well, so I guess.
We're being given the hook.
Yeah.
All right. That's it then.
Good job, Kat.
Thank you guys so much.
Thank y'all.
A hand
Thanks.
for our panelists. Thank you.